What started as a routine day of work for one plumber hired to clean out some clogged pipes at an apartment quickly turned into something you'd only expect to see in the most disturbed works of horror fiction. What was clogging these pipes were human remains.
A plumber had been called out to unblock the pipes after complaints about the smell. Inside he found what looked like meat, then overnight it vanished.
I woke up and he was strangling me.
Dennis Nilsen is one of the worst serial killers in all of the UK, if not the worst serial killer to come out of the UK in history.
The most exciting part of the little conundrum was when I lifted the body, carried it. It was an expression of my power to lift and carry and have control. And the dangling element of limp limbs was an expression of his passivity.
We're going to be discussing a deeply disturbed individual for this week's investigation, known as the UK's Jeffrey Dahmer. My name is Brianna, and I'm hot on the case. I don't know about you guys, but I'm definitely one of those people that signs up for free trials, but then forgets to unsubscribe by the time I'm billed for them, which is why I'm excited to tell you about today's sponsor, Rocket Money. With Rocket Money, I'm able to keep all of my subscriptions listed in one place. It's 10 times easier to stay on top of each one, and when I see one I know I'm not using anymore, I can cancel it easily right on the app with just a few taps. But Rocket Money isn't just for canceling subscriptions. It's an all-in-one personal finance app that also helps you lower your bills, set spending budgets, and help you manage your money a lot better. It helps me stay accountable for my spending habits, breaking everything down into weekly or monthly reports where I can see how much more I have to spend in certain areas, how many bills I have left unpaid, and what progress I've made towards my saving goals. Collecting all of these personalized insights and identifying ways to optimize my budget. And you can get started for free using my link, rocketmoney.com/Brianna, or you can scan the QR code or click the link in my description. Thank you again so much to Rocket Money, and now let's get back into this week's investigation. Dennis Nilsen was born on November 23rd, 1945 in Fraserburgh, Scotland, to parents Elizabeth and Olaf. He was the middle child with one older brother and a younger sister. Dennis's father wasn't the greatest. He was a Norwegian soldier that met Dennis's mother while he was stationed in Scotland during World War II. And throughout his entire career in the military, he was never really home. He neglected his family. And it really did seem that he had no interest in being a father, a husband, and a family man. So his parents split in 1948 when Dennis was only a toddler. His mother got a lot of support from her parents, so Dennis was extremely close with his grandparents, and especially his grandfather. He was the only real father figure in Dennis's life, and he meant everything to him. Growing up, Dennis was really lonely. He had a really hard time making friends. For one, because people thought that he was really weird. And also because Dennis really didn't think anyone around him was all that interesting to begin with. So his grandfather wasn't just the only father figure in his life, but he was also kind of his only friend, which is why when he was 7 years old and his grandfather unexpectedly passed away, it was extremely hard on Dennis. Not only was the passing of his grandfather extremely traumatic, but it was how he found out that his grandfather passed away that really screwed with him. Dennis Nilsen's grandfather was a deep sea fisherman and sometimes would be away for work for a few months at a time. And it was during one of these work trips that his grandfather passed away. Dennis knew when his grandfather left for these work trips, these fishing trips, that he would be gone for a long time. And on this particular day, he wasn't expecting his grandfather to be home for quite some time. But Dennis came home from school one day. He's 7 years old, so he's probably a second grader. He comes home and his mother is there waiting for him. And his mother told him that his grandfather was in the other room if he wanted to see him. So a very excited 7-year-old Dennis runs excitedly into the other room to see his grandfather and his best friend, but instead saw his grandfather's dead body. And this was something that really messed Dennis Nilsen up, and he would later say that it was this moment when he was 7 years old that turned him into the serial killer he would grow up to be. He completely withdrew, pulled away, and isolated himself even from the rest of his family. His mother would remarry and have 6 more children. So not only is Dennis really struggling and already feels extremely isolated, but now he's just like one of 9 children in this family, so he's getting even more loss in his own family. On top of that, Dennis really did not like his stepfather Adam. He thought that he was way too strict. He also just lost a father figure in his life with his grandfather, so it makes a lot of sense that when his stepfather comes into this new role that he would really not be into it, but he would later grow to respect his stepfather. Dennis did experience a great loss when his grandfather passed away, but at this point, there's not really any obvious signs that Dennis would grow up to become a serial killer. We typically see certain characteristics in children that grow up to become serial killers: cruelty to animals, bullying, abuse at home, but as far as I can find, there's not really any of that with Dennis. There was one major thing that he was struggling with though, and that was his sexuality. In his very early teenage years, Dennis really started to realize that he was attracted to other boys, and being gay in the 1950s and 1960s was looked at a lot differently than it is today. In fact, it wasn't even legal to be gay at this point where Dennis was living. It wouldn't even become legal in Scotland until the 1980s, so another like 20-30 years from where Dennis is growing up and living at this point. This was a huge secret that Dennis was keeping from everyone in his life, and he was really struggling with this. It was very confusing for him, and his older brother actually started to accuse Dennis of being gay around this point, so it was just a really awful time for Dennis. He would join the Army Cadet Force in 1961 at 14 years old and would go on to have an entire career in the military, traveling a lot. He might have wanted to leave home to escape his brother and to keep his sexuality a secret for longer, but there's another secret that Dennis was keeping that he also might have wanted to hide by running away. Dennis, as a young teenage boy, said that he tried to work through his confusing thoughts regarding his sexuality by molesting his younger siblings while they were sleeping. He might try to justify his horrific actions on his sexuality and just trying to figure it out, but I do not believe that that is the reason, fully at least, that Dennis was molesting his younger siblings. I do believe that Dennis Nilsen is a pedophile, and this is not the only time that he would sexually abuse children. Dennis Nilsen would travel a lot for the military. He would work in the kitchens, learning his skills as a butcher. Does come up later. And during this time, he started to heavily abuse alcohol. He was a big drinker, and he would be throughout this entire case. Once, while in Germany, he was out drinking with some of his buddies in the military, and he actually got so drunk that he blacked out and he woke up on the floor of one of the rooms. Nothing happened sexually that night, but it was this night that would fuel this sexual fantasy for Dennis about having a non-consensual sexual encounter with someone that was not present. So either asleep, knocked out, or dead. And after this moment, he would go on to hang out with some of his work buddies in the military. They would go out, get really drunk, and then Dennis would pretend to black out and be knocked out in the hope that one of them would sexually assault him. And this is just the beginning of this extremely dark fantasy that he had. While in Yemen at 21 years old, it is reported that Dennis Nilsen lost his virginity. But I'm not really the biggest fan of that wording because the person that Dennis slept with was a young Yemen boy, only 12 years old. Dennis, 21, this boy's 12, so it might start to make sense what I'm saying about Dennis being a child abuser in this way, because at this point, the only encounters he's had of this nature have involved children and have been completely non-consensual. Even if this 12-year-old boy said he was okay with it, he's 12 and cannot consent. And I actually saw it reported that this particular boy would only do these favors for these soldiers that came into Yemen because he wanted them to take him with them. He wanted out of his country. And unfortunately, this abuse with children does not stop here. After 11 years with the military, Dennis left in 1972 and he went back home to live with his family for a little bit until one day he got in a huge fight with his brother, and this fight was regarding gay rights. And the fight ended with his brother screaming for his mother to come in the room, and then Dennis's older brother told their mother that Dennis was gay. Dennis ended up leaving his home after this, and he never talked to his brother ever again and would really have little to no contact with the rest of his family ever again after this. He actually decides after this that he's just going to leave the country entirely, so he leaves Scotland and he moves to London, where the rest of our case takes place. In London, this is terrifying, Dennis decides that he wants to become a police officer, and he completes his training in 1973. And this would help him slightly in the crimes that he would go on to commit, because at this time specifically, and sometimes today, the other officers wouldn't be so easy to convince that one of their brothers would be guilty of such terrible things. Which I do have to say does surprise me a little bit, because Dennis was weird. He was caught multiple times obsessively going down into the morgue to look at the dead bodies, and he had a particular obsession with the dead bodies that had just had their autopsies completed. So the fact that no one in Dennis's life would ever suspect that he could be a creep after everything that they know, specifically at this point, is kind of confusing. London at the time was a lot more of an accepting place for members of the LGBTQ+ community, so there were a lot of gay bars opening in the area because of this. Dennis is still a very heavy drinker, and he would become a frequent patron of these establishments. He would also have quite a few one-night stands with men that he met at these bars, but these were consensual encounters that he was having, and because they were consensual, they weren't fulfilling for Dennis. He was not satisfied having a partner that was actually willing to sleep with him. So these fantasies that he's had for years at this point, he starts to try and fulfill. In 1973, shortly after becoming a police officer in London, he hooks up with a man, and this man wakes up after their hookup and sees that Dennis is taking photos of him, and he's not wearing any clothes. So this absolutely freaks out this guy, as it would anyone, I hope. So he goes to the police to try and report this, but the police, these are Dennis's colleagues. So Dennis is questioned, but he's never charged. And a year later, Dennis leaves the police force because he just doesn't feel like it's for him anymore. For a little bit after this, Dennis appears to be living a very normal life. He's working at a job center in London. He has a roommate for about a year named David before his roommate David moves out. He's renting an apartment at 195 Melrose Avenue, and even gets a little puppy, an adorable little girl he names Bleep. But this facade of this normal guy living a normal life would not last for very long. Over the next 5 years, Dennis would go on to commit some of the most disturbing crimes imaginable. And over the next 5 years, a lot of young gay men in London, visiting London, would start to vanish. As Dennis continues to have this string of one-night stands and casual hookups and very short relationships that go nowhere, he starts to think that this life just really isn't for him. But he's lonely. He wants someone there, but not these people, these short relationships, these hookups. And he still has these fantasies that we have touched on, and he starts to feel like he's ready to indulge in them. Completely ready to live this life of crime and unthinkable acts against innocent young men. On December 20th, 1978, a 33-year-old Dennis Nilsen meets a 14-year-old Stephen Holmes at a bar. I'm assuming that he had a fake ID, or maybe the bars in London at this point didn't ID, because this is a 14-year-old boy in a bar. Stephen was actually at a concert that night, and he wanted to keep the fun going out at these bars after this concert, where he meets this monster Dennis. Dennis invites Stephen back to his home, where he gives the young boy a bunch of alcohol, getting him very, very intoxicated. The next morning, while this 14-year-old boy, Steven, is sleeping, Dennis is absolutely panicking because he's overcome by these feelings of wanting to keep Steven there with him. He was desperate to not let this boy leave. He didn't want to be alone, and he would go to drastic, evil measures to ensure that Steven would not be leaving his apartment alive. Dennis strangles the 14-year-old boy while he sleeps with a necktie. And then when Steven is completely unconscious, he then drowns the child in a bucket of water. He has just committed murder, but this is not the end of what will become Dennis Nilsen's serial killer MO. After killing an innocent young man, Dennis would bathe their bodies and then shave them of any body hair. Again, odd considering his pattern with children. He would then usually put their bodies on his bed and then masturbate over them or on their bodies. He would later claim that he never committed full-on necrophilia, that he never penetrated his victims' dead bodies, but not sure if I believe that. And just what he's doing alone is considered necrophilia. So he's a killer, a child abuser, and a necrophiliac. He would then live with his victims' dead bodies for a very long time. He would sleep next to their bodies in his bed. He would prop them up in a chair with him and watch TV with them or cuddle them on the couch. And then after a while, he would hide their bodies under his floorboards up to months at a time before disposing of their bodies. With 14-year-old Stephen Holmes, he lived with his body for 8 months before bringing his body into the backyard of the apartment that he was renting and burning his body in the backyard. He would also disembowel and dismember his victims before or after they've been under his floorboards for months, and this goes back to his disturbing obsession with bodies after they have had their autopsies completed and his butchering skills that he learned while in the military. And disemboweling and dismembering bodies after they have been dead for months, I don't even want to think about the conditions that these bodies were in at the time. He was so convinced that he wouldn't be caught that he was barely hiding his crimes. Sometimes he would just throw body parts, organs, flesh, bones outside where anyone could stumble upon them, just hoping that the animals would take care of the rest. In October of 1975, Dennis meets Andrew Ho, a student from Hong Kong that was visiting London, and lures him back to his apartment under the guise of a casual hookup. He suggests that they do some bondage play, but then in the middle of it, while Andrew's tied up, Dennis attempts to strangle Andrew Ho to death. Luckily, he's able to escape and report this to the police. But for whatever reason, and this is completely Andrew's choice, he chooses not to press charges against Dennis. This might be because he wasn't out to his family, or he was afraid of his identity being released to the public if he did choose to press charges against Dennis. London might have been a more accepting place for members of the LGBTQ plus community, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Hong Kong was. So you can't blame him for doing what's best for him. It is unfortunate considering what Dennis goes on to do to many other young men. But you would think even if he doesn't want to press charges after getting a report like that, the police would still want to, I don't know, do their jobs and investigate, maybe question Dennis, maybe, but no, nothing happens. On December 3rd, 1975, Dennis Nilsen would meet a 26-year-old Kenneth O'Kindon, who was a student from Canada visiting family in London. When Dennis and Kenneth meet, Dennis offers to show him around the city, be his tour guide, so they have this entirely normal day together before inviting Kenneth back to his place where he gives him a bunch of drinks. This is what he always does. Dennis also shows Kenneth some of his music, so while Kenneth is listening to music with a pair of headphones that are wired headphones because it's the 1970s, Dennis comes up behind him and strangles Kenneth to death with the wired headphones that he was wearing. And then after killing this innocent young man for no reason, Dennis just sits down In front of Kenneth's dead body, he puts the headphones in his own ears and he listens to music for a while. The next morning, Dennis poses Kenneth's body for Polaroid photos that he took, and then he cuddled on the couch and watched TV with his corpse before moving his body underneath the floorboards. Dennis would purposefully choose victims he thought that no one would miss or bother reporting missing. He picked tourists, really vulnerable people, young men that lived on the streets, children. But even with Kenneth not being from the UK, he was still quickly reported missing. But the investigation into his disappearance would sadly go cold quickly. On May 17th, 1980, Dennis Nilsen met a 16-year-old runaway who was living on the streets of London named Martin Duffy. He offers the boy to crash at his place and he would feed him and give him shelter for the night. But back at his apartment, after Martin fell asleep, Dennis strangled him until he was unconscious. He drew a bath and then he drowned the boy in his bathtub. He was only 16 years old. He then washed his body, he shaved him like he typically did, and after pleasuring himself over Martin's body, Dennis would say that he had, quote, the youngest looking body he had seen so far, unquote. He then met and lured back to his apartment a 26-year-old sex worker and father named William Sutherland, who Dennis strangled to death in his apartment. There are also quite a few unidentified victims of Dennis Nilsen in this case, which is very, 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 very sad. These are men that Dennis killed that have not been identified through DNA or dental records or from Dennis being able to remember anything about them. Dennis's fifth victim, he said all he can remember about him was that he was a laborer who was in his mid to late 20s, but he would later claim that he made up this victim after being pressured by police to give them more information. His sixth victim, he claimed he killed in October 1980, and he was a sex worker that was between the ages of 20 and 30. His seventh victim, he claimed he killed in November 1980, and he was also in his 20s. He believed this man was homeless and clearly had lived a hard life, and he said that killing this innocent young man was as easy as taking candy from a baby. And then at some point during the 1980s, Dennis claims he took the life of a man around 25 to 30 years old. This man had long hair. He kind of looked like a hippie. They met at a bar, and then Dennis brought him back to his apartment where he killed him. He hid his body underneath the floorboards for a while before removing his body, dismembering his body, then putting his body parts into different plastic bags, and then storing them back under his floorboards. But he would also later claim that this is one of the victims that he made up because the police wanted more information from him and he felt pressured to give information to them. On January 4th, 1981, Dennis claims that he met his eighth victim at a bar. This boy was 18 years old with bright blue eyes. Dennis lured him back to his apartment where he killed him. A month later, he claims that he killed a man in his early 20s, but he couldn't remember really anything else about this boy. It just shows how little he actually cares. Like, obviously he doesn't care because he's killing these men, but he doesn't even care enough to remember anything about them. Sometimes he can't even remember how old they are. Maybe they're 20, maybe they're 30. That's an entire 10 years. I don't know. This case really gets to me. It makes me actually feel sick to my stomach. In April of 1981, he claims he killed his 11th victim, a man, again in his early 20s. He brought him back to his apartment where he killed him, but then he claims that he hung this victim's naked body in his apartment for an entire 24 hours before moving his body underneath the floorboards. But this, again, would be another victim that Dennis would later claim that he made up. In November 1980, Dennis lured a man named Douglas Stewart back to his home. Douglas fell asleep in Dennis's apartment, and then when he woke up, he realized that his ankles were tied to a nearby chair, and Dennis was on top of him, straddling him with his knee in his chest, trying to strangle him. Luckily, Douglas was able to overpower Dennis and escape, but during the struggle, Dennis started screaming out things like, "Take my money, just take my money." Dennis is very quick on his feet. I will give him that, at least, I guess. He lives in an apartment, so he's screaming out, take my money, because if any of his neighbors were to hear this struggle, and if Douglas tried to report him to the police, then Dennis would have his neighbors, these witnesses, that would be able to testify that that night it sounded like Dennis was actually the victim of an attack and a robbery. And Douglas would try to go to the police, but again, the police really weren't any help at all. The police completely dismissed Douglas, claiming his report of nearly being murdered was just a lover's quarrel. At this point, Dennis has at least a dozen, but probably over a dozen dead bodies hidden underneath his floorboards, and as you can only imagine, the smell was horrific. It is said that the smell of human decomposition is the worst smell in the entire world, and there's really not that much competition. And that's just one dead body, okay? He has at least 12, probably more, hidden underneath his floorboards right now. It smelled terrible. The apartment was completely just covered in swarms of bugs and flies and maggots. And his neighbors, again, like I said, he lives in an apartment, they start to notice all of this and they start to complain. So Dennis spends an entire day trying to get rid of all the bodies that are underneath his floorboards. Some of these innocent young men's bodies had been underneath Dennis Nilsen's floorboards for 8 months. Decomposition at this point would have been severe. The maggots would have made it a lot worse. And that's not even mentioning the smell. Dennis first starts by dismembering his victims. He said that it was so disgusting he would have to take breaks to go throw up and was heavily drinking during the entire process just so he could get through it. But he would still masturbate on top of their corpses during this process. He would then boil some of his victims' dismembered body parts and their heads to try and remove the flesh from them, like their skulls and whatnot. And then he would carry all of their remains into the backyard of his apartment.
On a weekend, I would sort of pull out the floorboards, and I found it totally unpleasant, and I'd get blinding drunk, so I could face it, and start dissection on the kitchen floor. And I'd go out and be sick outside, and the guard would haul the body out onto the floorboards, put it on the sheet, and then cut it out. The most exciting part of the little conundrum was when I lifted the body, carried it. It was an expression of my power to lift and carry and have control. And the dangling element of limp limbs was an expression of his passivity.
Yes.
The apartment that he was renting, it looks like a house, but it's separated into different apartments, and the backyard was supposed to be a communal space that everyone could use. But when Dennis moved into his apartment, he was able to convince his landlord to give him full and sole access to the backyard. And in the backyard, he set up a fire pit, and then he burned his victims' bodies while simultaneously burning a tire, hoping that the smell of burning rubber would cover up the smell of burning, rotting flesh. Neighborhood kids would even pass by on their bikes and whatnot and would stop and watch this huge fire in this backyard, having no idea the true horrors behind what they were seeing. And once Dennis was done, he started to feel bad. He would later admit that sometimes he felt really bad for what he was doing, but his sadness rarely was felt for his actual victims. No, he felt bad for himself, but he didn't feel bad enough to stop killing. Dennis Nilsen would say that he felt better having his victims' bodies in his home with him. Without them, he felt very lonely. So even though Dennis has just gone through a lot to try and remove all of his victims' bodies from his apartment, he almost immediately goes out and starts looking for another victim. Dennis Nilsen met 23-year-old Malcolm Barlow while walking around London one night. Malcolm at this point had lived a very hard life. He was an orphan that suffered with severe epileptic seizures since he was a child and was currently on new medicine to treat his seizures, but unfortunately, this night, he suffered a really bad reaction to his new medicine, and on that fateful day, he was slumped over on a building when he met Dennis Nilsen. Dennis, during different parts of this case, shows a very odd hero complex. I wonder if he has maybe a god complex, where he enjoys choosing who lives and who dies. Because after Dennis was just walking down the street and he finds Malcolm in this very vulnerable state, he actually goes to get him medical help and to get him to a hospital. And Malcolm was in the hospital for an entire day before being released. And the only thing he could think about was this stranger who saved his life. And I'm guessing when Dennis brought him to the hospital, he had to sign in and give some of his information because Malcolm got Dennis's address and went over to his apartment to say thank you for saving him. But it was this choice to thank a man that saved his life that will ultimately end Malcolm's life. Dennis invited Malcolm inside where he gave him a lot of alcohol, got him very drunk, and then strangled him to death. The day before, Dennis chooses to save this young man's life, and then the very next day, he chooses to end it. Shortly after this, Dennis would lose his apartment. His landlord had plans to renovate the property, but Dennis was really adamant about not vacating his apartment. And the landlord actually had to bribe him with £1,000 just to get Dennis to agree to leave. And he eventually does agree to leave. Part of him was thinking that if he left this apartment, then maybe he would stop killing. So before he leaves, he dismembers and burns Malcolm's body. The next apartment he moves into is an attic apartment on 23 Cranley Gardens. And shortly after moving into this new apartment, he lures 23-year-old John Howlett to his apartment that he met at a bar. After John fell asleep, he strangled him. But John woke up and he fought for his life. Something Dennis would do is he would strangle his victim, not enough to kill them, but until they lost consciousness. And then sometimes he would let them wake up and then he would strangle them again. And he would repeat this process a few times. And this is torture. There's no other way to put it. This is Dennis enjoying himself, enjoying the kill. After strangling and reviving John Howlett over and over again, he kills him by drowning him in a bathtub, and then he dismembers him. Dennis no longer has his burn pit. He doesn't have a backyard anymore. So he's brainstorming ways to dispose of his victim's body, and he settles on throwing them in the trash and or flushing them down the toilet. In 1982, Dennis meets 21-year-old Carl Stoddard and invites him back to his apartment. Carl spends the night, but he's sleeping in a sleeping bag on the floor of Dennis's bedroom. And then in the middle of the night, he wakes up. And at first, he's very groggy and he's confused. He doesn't really know what's going on. It feels like he can barely breathe. And for a second, he thinks that maybe he's wrapped up in his sleeping bag. But actually, Dennis was on top of him, strangling him. And then it all goes black. When he wakes up, he's still really out of it. He's very confused, but then he hears running water. Dennis is running a bath. And before Carl can do or say anything, Dennis is shoving his head underneath the water. He keeps trying to fight back. He would be able to fight enough to get his head above water, just long enough to beg Dennis for his life before having his head shoved back under the water again. And then Carl stops fighting back, and he stops moving altogether. Dennis then moves what he believes is Carl's dead body to a chair in his living room so they can watch TV together. But Carl, he's not dead. Miraculously, he survived, and he wakes up again to Dennis's dog Bleep licking his face. But Carl is still very, very weak. He's alive, but barely. And then this goes to show Dennis's weird God complex he has, where he likes to decide who lives and who dies. Dennis doesn't choose to kill Carl in this moment. He sees Carl is still alive, and he helps fully revive Carl. And when Carl starts to come to, Dennis wraps his arms around him, and he gives him a huge hug. Carl is terrified because the last thing he remembers is Dennis trying to murder him. And now Dennis is hugging him, and he tells him that he's confused. Dennis tells Carl he's confused, and he actually almost did suffocate in his sleeping bag. And Dennis was just trying to splash water on his face to wake him up. He's just completely gaslighting him, and it works. I mean, most people would probably want to believe this story rather than believe that the person in front of you that you are now alone with that is hugging you was just trying to murder you a few minutes ago. It might have even been Carl's mind trying to protect him that convinced him that what he knows to be true and what he remembers isn't actually true. Dennis, for some reason, I can't even begin to try and explain, then nurses Carl back to health for 2 days. And then when Carl is strong enough, Dennis opens up his door and he lets Carl leave. Later that same year, Dennis invites 27-year-old father named Graham Allen back to his apartment. Graham was a tourist visiting London, and he actually stopped Dennis to ask him for directions. And after Graham goes back to Dennis's apartment with Dennis with the promise of a home-cooked meal, he was strangled to death. Dennis then kept his body in his bathtub for 3 days before dismembering him and disposing parts of his body by flushing them down his toilet. Later on, in 1983, Dennis lures a 20-year-old boy named Stephen Sinclair back to his apartment. Stephen was unfortunately very addicted to the hard drug heroin and had actually recently tried to take his own life. Dennis and Stephen met on the streets of London. Dennis could see how vulnerable and desperate Stephen was, and he offered him a meal. And then back at his apartment, he gave Stephen a lot of alcohol, and he let Stephen use heroin in his apartment, and then he strangled him to death. He washed his body and then posed him on his bed surrounded by mirrors. He then lied naked next to Stephen's body and just looked at him and Stephen through all the mirrors that were surrounding his bed. He then dismembered Stephen and put his body into different plastic bags and then hid them away in his dresser and in the drawers in his bathroom. Now, as I'm sure a lot of you can imagine, the plumbing in Dennis Nilsen's attic apartment wasn't necessarily the best, and him trying to flush human remains down his toilet started to cause a lot of problems. The pipes were completely clogged. And I guess Dennis doesn't know how this possibly occurred because he calls his landlord to complain about it, and then the landlord sends over a plumber. This plumber was a man named Michael Catherine. He thinks it's just going to be another day on the job, but while he's taking a look at the pipes and pulling out what's clogging it, he realizes that he's pulling out flesh and bone. Could you even imagine? When he brings this up to Dennis, who is very quick on his feet, tries to come up with a story, and he says that he had some KFC, Kentucky Fried Chicken, and he decided to flush the chicken bones down the toilet. Weird, right? Super weird. Well, Michael thinks so too, and he has a terrible thing about this. You know, human bones and chicken bones, they definitely look really different. But try to put yourself in this guy's shoes. He's just a plumber coming to work a job, and he's pulling bones out of this guy's toilet. No one would want to believe that they are finding human remains down some random guy's toilet. So he has a terrible feeling about this, but he really does try to push all of these thoughts away. Realizing that this is going to be a bigger job than expected, Michael finishes up for the day and tells Dennis he will be back tomorrow to finish up the job. But when Michael returns the very next day and goes to look at the drain, all of this flesh and bones that were just there the day before are completely gone. Dennis had gone into the pipes himself, and he had cleaned them all out. Now, Michael is extremely suspicious, and as he's looking through the pipes further back, he finds even more and more bones and flesh. And he knows now for certain, this isn't fried chicken. And he goes down to the police with some of what he found flushed down Dennis Nilsen's toilet, and they run some tests, and they confirm that these are human remains.
When were you called to the house?
First instance, Tuesday evening, 6:15.
That was from the estate agents?
Yes, that's correct.
Because of a blocked toilet?
Block pipe between the toilet and the main sewer.
It was then that you made the discovery?
After initial investigation, yes. Yeah.
What did you find?
A mass of flesh, shall we say, which at first...
You know what you'd found?
Heavily suspected. I have a limited knowledge, but very heavily suspected that it wasn't animal, shall we say.
Did anyone express any particular interest in what you found?
Certainly. Yeah, most of them were quite interested, shall we say. There was some talk about calling the police, but how often does one find remains of a body down a drain, you know? Chances are it could have been deep freezer meat, any food stuff remains, but there just seemed to be too much of it, shall we say. There was an awful lot of it.
Was there enough there for more than one body?
Quite possibly. Quite possibly.
They now, finally, for the first time in this case, actually go to Dennis's apartment to talk to him. And the second they are inside, they're hit with this disgusting smell. And they know, as police officers, that this is the smell of human decomposition. But Dennis is denying everything and everything. He has no idea what's going on, but he's very calm throughout this entire thing. But at this point, police know that a murder definitely took place in this apartment. But that's important to remember. They think they are dealing with one murder, not a serial killer. So imagine their shock when Dennis just calmly walks over to his dresser. He opens it up, and inside are multiple dismembered body parts coming from multiple different people. But all the officers see right now are just plastic bags that are tied up in this dresser. So they ask Dennis, what are we looking at here? How many people have you killed? How many bodies are we gonna find? 1 or 2? And Dennis just calmly says, neither. I think maybe 15 or 16. He gives a full detailed confessions of the horrors that took place in both of his apartments. 15 or 16 murders in the past 5 years. And when police asked Dennis why, what was your motive? He only replied, I was hoping you would tell me. So he doesn't even know or understand why he has murdered 16 innocent people. He just wanted to. Dennis was charged with 1 murder originally, but it was later upgraded to 6 murders and 2 attempted murders. It was extremely hard for them to identify all of his victims and to get an official count on how many people he actually killed because they couldn't find evidence of all of their remains at this point. And if you're maybe wondering what happened to Dennis Nilsen's dog, his loyal companion, Bleep, that he had during his entire time as a serial killer, well, after his arrest, authorities decided that it would be best to euthanize his 8-year-old dog, Bleep. And this is something that I absolutely do not agree with at all. Bleep was healthy, nothing was wrong with her, and she was completely innocent, and she only died because of the terrible, evil actions of her owner. She didn't do anything, but she was killed just because she was owned by an evil person. Dennis Nilsen's trial began on October 24th, 1983, and he would attempt to plead not guilty by reason of insanity or diminished responsibility, claiming that he had no memory of his murders. He was in a trance the entire time, and he would just wake up each time next to a dead body. And he also put a lot of blame on his alcohol abuse. This, again, doesn't make a lot of sense because most people in a situation like that, if you got drunk and woke up next to a dead body with no idea what happened the night before, would probably call the police. But also, it doesn't make sense because if you remember, Dennis gave extremely detailed confessions of each murder. So in my opinion, this is complete BS. And Carl, during the trial, was able to testify against Dennis Nilsen. If you remember Carl, he was the man that was almost murdered by Dennis, but then was nursed back to health by Dennis with the claims that he didn't try to kill him. He actually was trying to help him. And I bet this at least was very validating for Carl. He was completely gaslit into thinking that this man wasn't actually trying to murder him when he knew he was. So I bet it was, very helpful for him to know that he can trust himself and trust his own memories, and what he remembered happening is actually what happened. On November 4th, 1983, Dennis Nilsen was found guilty on all charges, and the judge sentenced him to life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. But in 1994, his sentence was increased to life without the possibility of parole. And even Dennis himself accepted this sentence and said that he believed it was the correct punishment for all of the terrible things that he did. Dennis Nilsen had an okay time in prison. He would play a lot of keyboard. He had a keyboard in his cell, but he was once attacked in prison. He was stabbed and slashed by another inmate in the face and in the chest, and actually had to get 89 stitches after this attack, but he did survive. And then in May of 2018, he got really, really sick. And on May 12th, 2018, he passed away at the age of 72 years old after serving 34 years of his life sentence. He never once expressed remorse for his victims or his victims' families, and in fact said that he never lost sleep over the terrible things that he did, and he would have kept killing until he was caught. He would have kept killing until he had 150 victims. While behind bars, Dennis Nilsen recorded a lot of tapes and wrote a manuscript for his autobiography that he wanted published, but the prison guards actually took this away from him and did not want this being published, but it was later published 3 years after he died in 2021, and his autobiography was called The History of a Drowning Boy. And I think, I didn't read this, putting that out there, I did not read this. I didn't even bother reading like the synopsis. But I do believe that this title is in reference to a near-death experience that Dennis had when he was a little boy. I think he was 10 years old and he almost drowned. But before he was saved by another boy, he claimed that he made peace with the fact that he was about to die. And just this like wave of peace went over him. And it was very, very peaceful in that moment. And I'm wondering, while researching this case, if he chose to end his victims' lives, or at least most of his victims' lives, by drowning them. He would strangle them till they were unconscious, and then he would drown them. I wonder if in his sick, twisted mind, he thought that he was doing his victims a favor, to let them go in a peaceful way, like he remembers almost drowning. But let me know all your thoughts about that. And that is all I have for this very sick, twisted, disturbing case. Really interested to hear all of your thoughts and opinions in the comments. But while you're there, please always remember to be respectful. There are a lot of victims in this case. There's a lot of victims' families and loved ones and friends that are affected by this case, and a lot of families that were affected by Dennis Nilsen that never even got closure because their loved ones were never even identified and are still missing. And that is really, really, really hard. So please always remember to be respectful. While you're in the comments, please let me know what case you want to see me cover next. I read every single comment that comes through, and I take case suggestions directly from the comments. So if you have a case you want to see covered on Hot in the Case, please drop it down in the comments. And that is all I have for this week's investigation. I will see you guys all next Friday when we are hot in the case once again.